When you watch my videos, you viewer, when you watch any of them, do you ever get the distinct impression that you're dealing with a believer? Do you ever get the impression that I actually, on some level, actually believe what I'm saying? In other words, I'm not rationally convinced. My guts tell me something is correct. That would not surprise me in the least. And it would not surprise me in the least if it were somehow I were able to have that pointed out to me conclusively. That my biases run so deep that I've ceased to notice them. Now, I would say that in a certain sense that may be inevitable. It may be an inevitable part of being human, because how much of our knowledge is conscious knowledge and how much of it is simply belief-based, i.e. we simply react to that which we believe with our bellies as opposed to believing with our minds. How much of your actual actions are conscious? For example, I'm talking to you on this webcam and I talk with my hands, and even though my hands are off camera, I'm sort of moving my hands around where you can't see them. That's a completely unconscious act. Now that I've become conscious of it, I've stopped doing it. There you go. So how much of what we do is conscious or unconscious? A lot of people say that my eyebrows bob up and down when I talk like that. That too is unconscious. I don't mean to do that, but I do it. It's not as though it's happening all by itself. How much of what we do and think actually works in that way? Where we are actually, in a sense, doing it volitionally, but we're not conscious of the fact that we're doing it volitionally. See, if I pay attention to what my eyebrows are doing, my eyebrows will stop going up and down like that, as they will when I talk. So there is a certain degree of conscious choice there, isn't there, for me to move my eyebrows? But if I just sort of forget myself for a bit, that will just happen in and of or apparently of its own accord. But it's not of its own accord, because I've demonstrated to myself that I can actually intervene to stop my eyebrows doing this when I'm talking. I can stop waving my hands around. I don't need to do it. I'm not determined to do this, at least in terms of my perception of what's going on. I can stop moving my hands. Now, can that happen in terms of thinking? Can your thoughts end up working the same way? I would argue that they can, and that may be one of the best sort of illustrations of prolepsis. Prolepsis is when you see or you perceive what you expect to see. Your prolepsis is what you expect to see, and your hupolepsis is what you see or perceive when you are actually in the moment of perception, and your hupolepsis is strongly influenced, if not decisively, by your prolepsis. Bias. Now, that kind of bias is very difficult to detect even in yourself, because you essentially have to watch every single thought that you have and analyze it right back to its source in real time. That is one heck of a tall order, detecting one's own bias. Am I biased when I do X? Okay, let me see if I am. And, work backwards and try and detect your own bias. It's not an easy thing to do. Now, if it's difficult to detect one's own bias, how much more difficult must it be to detect someone else's bias? Everyone is convinced that the other guy is biased because his or her biases are so obviously on display. Yes, I agree, but how do you stop yourself from being biased? And is somebody else's bias really an argument against what they're saying? Is prolepsis fundamental to being human? That's an interesting question. Because when I look at, say, Benatar's illustration of the asymmetry, I detect a bias there. I detect a bias first off when he places it as a sort of a balance, a scale, where he measures pleasure versus suffering. Now, what does he include on each side? First of all, suffering. I think that we're sort of having trouble getting right to the bottom of what suffering actually is. I think suffering is an experience. Experience implies a subject. An object that is subjected to the experience, an I, an identity. And if it's not an experience, then what happens to actual suffering itself, you see? In order for there to be suffering, there has to be an identity. There has to be something experiencing said suffering. If there's nothing experiencing the suffering, then the suffering isn't taking place. It has to be visited upon something. So, okay, it does seem as though Benatar is positing the existence of an identity, an I, of a first-person viewpoint, a first-person observer of reality. But by the same token, what flows from that, he seems to want to deny. Again, I'm just sort of trying to detect bias, as it were. I'm not trying to impute these ideas to what he's saying. I'm just trying to see, in my view, that he's constructed a double bind here, how I might illustrate that he has constructed a double bind. He seems to imply that the I doesn't exist, because what flows from the I is all kinds of things that really don't seem, there are all kinds of pluses that seem to transcend mere pleasure. Schlock of God made a video a number of years ago where he said that agency, in and of itself, the ability to act, and agency isn't necessarily free will here, but the ability to act, actually to make choices, to choose to act, actually more than compensates for any asymmetry, that even if we do take Benatar at his word that there is an asymmetry, agency more than compensates for that, because Benatar says only that which exists can suffer. Yes. Again, you're positing the view of an I, but only that which exists has agency as well. Now you sort of think, what good is agency? Well, okay, are we going to examine what good agency is? Well, agency assumes that there is an I there first. Secondly, I would say that what good is agency? Okay, how many revolutions have we had in this world? What have people done to assert their own freedom in this world? What will a slave do, given a quarter of a chance when they find themselves in that situation of being a slave? What do I do to block or to fend off challenges to my own agency? That's kind of will to power-ish. But, one could even say it's the will to choice, the will to agency. Do we have the will to agency? Is agency important to us? Now, the agency comes from the existence of an I. Agency is proactiveness. The agency is the ability to sort of make actual decisions. I mentioned before, and I keep bringing this idea up again, that there are several different views of time. The conventional view, or the one that I understand most people to be making, is, again, you're sitting in a car, a moving car, and you're looking backwards through the window, the rear window, and the world is going by you like this. You're seeing the world sort of go by you, and things are appearing in the periphery, and reality is what's taking place as everything goes by you. Now, the aim, I would assume, of trying to invoke agency is to turn around and to look over the driver's shoulder through the windshield into the face of becoming. Now, again, you get metaphors, particularly in Zopfe. If you actually turn around and look into the face of becoming, it will kill you. That's the monster with things coming out of its mouth, right? That's the horror of becoming. Existential panic, the primal shriek, the primal horror. The true horror that lies at the base of all horror and all anxiety and all fear. In the Bhagavad Gita, it is referred to as the Vishvarupa, the universal vision, where you're no longer seeing form, you're seeing everything all merged together at once. You're seeing reality for what it actually is. There are any number of illustrations of this primal horror of everything. If you've ever suffered from chronic anxiety or gone through a period of anxiety that just stays with you at all times, and you're walking around in a state of horror and you don't know what it is, I would say that you're approaching something along the lines of existential panic. You're approaching something that is along the lines of existential horror. So that's what we're trying to illustrate here. that one is attempting to use the past as an anchor, as it were. So we're looking at time going by in this way, and we're doing it we're engaging our agency when we do this, because what we're doing is we're trying to avoid staring becoming in the face. I call it the monster of becoming. There's Nietzsche's eternal recurrence, I think, is a good illustration of becoming. What if everything just is? What if there's no past, present, or future? What if it's just things are what they are? Stop. There's no future, there's no past, there's just becoming. Pantahrai, with you in the driver's seat. That may be the case. But agency would seem to say that we have some control over either how we perceive that moment of existential panic, or how we even transcend the panic that is inherent in the moment of existential realization, of realizing that we are in this driver's seat. Benatar seems to say that we don't have the capacity to do this. That we don't have the capacity to do anything other than look through the rear window, the rear view window of a moving car, and watch things go by this way. Otherwise, if you take any other view of time, then you're implying agency. You're implying that I have the conscious choice of seeing time differently. I have the conscious choice of turning around and taking the full force, the full fire hose of becoming, of existence, square in the face. The whole Quentin, where he says that existence itself is bugging me and it's following me everywhere. Do I have the capacity to place value on my own existence? Do I have the capacity to act in the face of my own existence, in the face of existence itself, in the face of existential awareness, existential panic? Do I have the capacity to do that? Agency. And what does that do to the asymmetry? What does that do to the view that there is only pleasure? We're only on the receiving end of our experiences. We have no control over them. We have no prolepsis, nor do we have any hupolepsis. He seems to imply this, and he doesn't seem to actually deal with it. He seems to come from a deterministic universe, or a deterministic conception of the universe. I would almost call it a hard deterministic view of the universe, because in his view of things, it seems like we are simply the subjects, or rather the objects of what happens. I get confused here using these terms. There go my eyebrows again. We are simply on the receiving end of things, according to Benatar. All of experience and existence is something that is simply happening to us. We do not have any say in it. That, to me, is inescapable from his view of the asymmetry. Pleasure versus suffering. Pleasure is an experience that you are on the receiving end of, and suffering is something that you are on the receiving end of. What about other things where you've, as it were, taken the bull by the horns? You've opted to ride the tiger. What would you call that? You could argue that that doesn't exist, but again, that militates against the entire idea of trying to promote antinatalism, which he does. When you ask somebody to invoke their faculty of choice, you're implying that a faculty of choice actually exists. Now, this is why I asked this question at the beginning of belief, or unconscious belief. When I reach this point, inevitably things start to break down. I had an interesting, rather enjoyable interaction yesterday with Alexander Zapata about this, about the idea that we have absolutely no choice, but we are still responsible for the outcomes of what we do, even though we don't do anything. In a hard deterministic sort of conception of the universe, one could say that we're not really doing anything. We don't even exist as individual agents. We are simply, we're not even making choices to do anything. We are simply on the receiving end of all of our experiences. That's it. We are simply looking through the rear window of that moving car and watching experiences go by. We have no input. That's the implication of an asymmetry that says that it's only we are mere passive experiencers of that which we experience. We have no input. But the problem is, of course, he then says, you do have some input because you have the fundamental ability to not have kids. And he implies that that's a moral imperative, that we have the moral obligation. So it's this hellish situation that he's placed us in, the double bind. And this is another sort of aspect of a double bind that he may not have consciously created. He may simply not be aware of his own biases. That's why I am always quick to point out that I may not be aware of my own biases, obvious biases that other people can see. That's just the way perspectivism seems to work. We all have our own biases. What can we do about that? It seems inevitable that we're going to have them. Right down to the actual experiential level and your perception of time itself. Are you sitting in the car watching the world go by, or are you turned around looking through the windshield at the stream of becoming, which Zapfi says, don't do. That is the one thing you must never do. That is the door you must never open. That is forbidden. Zapfi seems to imply the same thing. He not only does he say that our lives are actually worse than we think they are, which is kind of a lunatic thing to say, because you sort of think, who is in a position to judge the quality of my life more than I am? Maybe I'm not in a position to judge my own quality of life, the own quality of my own existence. I'll allow for that. But if I'm not, who is? Like, it seems crazy. But he does make that case in his book that people are not able to actually accurately assess their own quality of existence. That means that there's an objective standard out there, which I don't believe. Anyway, but again, that's just perspectivism and bias. But look at it this way. We can't avoid bias because bias begins right at the existential level. Bias begins when we start to imagine things, or we start to use things like form, like identity, like non-contradiction. Bias starts to creep into our thinking when we even start to use concepts like suffering, like agency, like the will, like whether or not there is free will. All of that. Even the concept of an error implies a bias, because you're seeing something that isn't there. Therefore, your information is incorrect that you're basing your opinions on. Now, that again, if you're making an error, that assumes that there is such a thing as errors to be made. So much for hard determinism, right? How do you sort of say that someone has got an inaccurate view of reality in a purely deterministic universe? You can't, because there's no error out there. There's no right or wrong. Things are just unfolding. And ultimately, there are no choices being made. It's not as though anyone is choosing to do anything. You are simply determined to do everything. But even, I would say, even looking at the universe in terms of a split between free will and determinism is a use of one's agency. I don't see how that is you can actually get around that. And if you don't have agency, then what is a person trying to get you to do when they're trying to tell you not to do something, i.e. not to breed? Why are you advocating for a position over which advocacy will have no effect? I'm going to do what I'm going to do because I'm determined to do it. Furthermore, what does an absence of agency say about things like crime, the entire concept of crime, the entire concept of violating someone else's rights? What does that say about that? First of all, if you don't have agency, do you have any rights? Secondly, if you don't have agency, how is there culpable behavior in anything that you ever do? There is no culpability in anything. You're simply doing what you were determined to do. It's not as though you can be a good or a bad person at all. You don't have the capacity to do that in a purely deterministic universe. And if you do have the capacity to be a good or a bad person, to choose between the two, then you have agency. And agency has enormous value. You want evidence that agency has enormous value? Look around you in the universe. Look around you in human society. What will people do to protect their own autonomy, perceived or not? Even if they don't actually, or even if they, like, let's say in some way that people don't have agency, what will they do based upon the illusion that they have agency? In other words, agency has value. I guess Nietzsche would have called it the will to power. I would just call it maybe agency. The will to have control over one's own existence. We seem to want this. What happens when other people interfere in what we're trying to do? And something that we have decided is important. How do we react to when people interfere in what we're doing? We tend to resist these things strenuously. Why do we do that? I will protect my freedom of action, or my perceived freedom of action even, with enormous efforts, even if it costs me in terms of pleasure, even if it costs me in terms of suffering. I will willingly endure a lot of suffering, and so will a lot of humans, in order to protect either my agency or my belief in my own agency. Why is that? Where does that fit into the asymmetry? Why is it left out? Again, it's a bias that might be built right into Benatar's view of existence, the metaphysics of existence, the metaphysics of consciousness. And it's interesting that came out in a couple of discussions that I've had recently, one of them with Artificer a couple of days ago, the other one with Alexander Zapata yesterday. It's fascinating, again, when you sort of think that you've stumbled across belief. I don't blame anyone for thinking that I believe certain things, that I have certain prolepsis, I have certain precognitions, I have certain biases that I project outward. It may be that I don't have the capacity not to be biased. But when you see somebody who's saying we live in a hard deterministic universe, but they then advocate for people to invoke their agency and not do bad things, and insist upon individual responsibility for actions and saying that you are causing suffering by doing X, even though in another breath they're sort of saying you're not causing anything, you're just a link in the causal chain. I think that I've come across actual visceral belief there, and there's nothing wrong with that. Again, I'm saying a visceral sort of belief may be an inherent part of what we are. We may have no option but to actually believe things. The only circumstance under which I assume that we wouldn't actually believe anything ever, it's when we have consciously opted to look that fire hose of oncoming experience, of oncoming existence, the moment of becoming square in the face. When we've actually opted to look at reality for what it really is, not for what our past has allowed us to determine the present is or existence is, but for what it actually is. Remove all bias, and per Zapfe and per a lot of other people, perhaps. There's even elements of this in Thomas Ligotti and H.P. Lovecraft. We might go insane if we see reality for what it actually is. We might. In fact, many people probably would go insane, but it's not guaranteed. You get rid of all your preconceptions and all your biases and all your beliefs, you've got no more anchors. And as Zapfe says, guess what happens when you jettison all of those? Well, maybe Zapfe, maybe not. And maybe for 90% of humans, there's nothing in this universe except to avoid facing that moment of existential panic, that moment of existential anchoredness or anchoredlessness. We will do anything to avoid that. Okay, maybe that goes for most people. Maybe that's why we have this big illusion out there called the past, society, all this kind of thing, all these anchors that Zapfe says that we have. Maybe that's the purpose of all of this. But there's no guarantee that in all cases we will be destroyed by looking into the face of becoming. And I think that bias is the only sort of weapon that we have to avoid looking into the face of becoming, and bias creeps in everywhere. As I say, I think that when people sort of say, you have no free will, but you're responsible for what you're doing, that to me is belief speaking. And I don't even say that as a criticism. I say that as just an example, or at least what looks like belief to me. When I see a rational person believing in things that seem to militate against each other, I see someone who is actually not thinking logically, which is okay. I'm not saying that we have to think logically. Again, logic is our tool. But what I would say is, when you're not thinking logically, you're thinking intuitively. Belief.